We are going to get started now with Jeremy Singer-Vine. Jeremy is a data journalist and a computer programmer. As you all may have heard who were on, he has been the data editor at Buzzfeed. He is now breaking off to kind of do a new project, and then the plan is that he will take that back on again. He also has worked at Wall Street Journal and Slate. Now I know from your applications, a lot of you mentioned, I'm doing this data work, but I'm my own fact checker. I just want to make sure I'm getting everything right. Jeremy is going to walk with us the best ways to structure your data and getting at all of those things. So hopefully he'll address a lot of your concerns today. And with that, Jeremy, please take it away. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Anne. Yeah, the idea I had for this workshop is to sort of go back to basics. What we do may be elementary for some of you, in which case, please do, you can be co-teachers in a way and, share your expertise and your what you've learned over the years. For other people, it may be new. And at the very least, it's just some practice and a chance to discuss some of the fundamentals of taking information and structuring it into spreadsheets or into structured data more generally. There's no sort of right answer or wrong answer. There are lots of ways to structure data. A lot of it depends on what exactly you intend to do with it. But we'll have a chance to explore some of those possibilities, one way to put it. So what I'm going to do is share with you in the chat, assuming everyone can get there, a link to the first prompt. It's just a little document with a short little prompt. I happen to be reading almost done with The Shining, so I use that as the inspiration. And the goal here is to take what you see in this prompt and also share it on my screen just to make sure that everyone has a chance to see it. And you'll create a Google Sheet, and you will do what you think is going to be the most useful representation of this information for you in a Google Sheet. And then we'll take about, let's say, 5 minutes for that. And you'll share with me at the email address I've listed at the top, your sheet, and we'll go over some examples. I'll remove identifying information so you don't have to feel sheepish about sharing them.
And just to clarify, you said you want this in Google Sheets, right?
Yeah, if you happen for whatever reason not to be able or prefer not to do it in Google Sheets, you could do it as an Excel file and send it to me at the same address. I see these coming in. Thank you. I'm going to take a moment to copy them over and we'll start talking about them. In the meantime, while we're doing that, does anyone have any immediate thoughts and feedback?
It's amazing how much data you can get from just like 2-3 paragraphs.
Totally. Yeah. What do you put my thumb on the scales a little bit in that I wrote it with that purpose entirely, so with a density of information, but it's not totally unusual. I had a few of the first ones I got, and we probably won't have time to go over every single one, but if anyone really wants feedback on one, I can do, you can ask me directly or we can talk about it afterward, but I think we have a few representative ones for now that we can start talking about. So before we go to the specifics, now that everyone's had a chance, I think, to send theirs in, was there anything confusing or things that puzzled you or you weren't sure what to deal with when you were first making your spreadsheet?
Looking at Danny's age and his birth date compared with the date, it looks like he's not 5 years old.
Great. Very well done. Yeah, so that raises one thing, which is we can structure data. And when we do that, we are in some ways translating our primary source, right? And things get lost along the way, including an understanding of what part of the information came from our primary source and what is our interpretation or our understanding of it, right? And so one question you might ask, you might want to think about is, how do I deal with something that is wrong? There are lots of ways to do it, some more convoluted than others. One thing you might do is have here, for example, I think you can see the spreadsheet I have up on the screen.
Mhm.
You might add a column called notes, and you might say Danny's birth date or age appears to be incorrect / impossible. That's one way, definitely. That's, again, a lot of this depends on how do you plan to use your spreadsheet. If, for example, you have a lot of people in this sheet and you're going to want to do something more manual, you're not going to be able to read through every note carefully every time you want to do an analysis. You could, let me move the screen a little bit. You could have another column that's something like, let's say, age questionable.
Mm.
You could have it say, it could be a 0 or 1 or yes and no, or it could be, depending on how you do things, you have a star. Let's say age questionable, no, no, yes, 0, 0, 1. You could imagine other ways of handling it, but those are the two that come to mind most immediately. Right? Some way of reflecting the quality of the data you're working with. Great. Any other questions? Or things you want to put up for discussion?
So hi, Jeremy, how are you?
Hey, Kobe, good to see you.
I used to work with Jeremy, FYI. So you know how the age thing was the first thing I picked up. So I'm wondering, is it bad that I excluded it because of that? I was like, this isn't accurate, so I'm just going to leave the date of birth and not put in the age.
Very interesting. So what I would ask with that is, how do you know that it's the date of birth that's correct and the age that's wrong, or vice versa?
Well, because I'm taking the information at face value, but with the age, I was able to calculate that, obviously, but with the date of birth, like I would have to check their social security number and all of that. But
right. And
with
another way to think about it maybe would be that the date of birth seems more precise and more exact, and you could say either more likely to have a mistake in it or more official seeming. In this case, I believe that it's actually the date of birth that's wrong. I mean, the date of births are sort of made up. I looked online, there's no official date of birth for these people, but the ages are the believed ages of the kids and the adults, or Danny and the adults. Right, so one option would be to leave one of them out. And in that case, I think you're best off having some note reflecting that, right? Explaining to you now, to your future self, to other people who might be reading the spreadsheet, what that blank means. And we'll get to blanks actually in the next exercise a little bit, and other ways of dealing with them. But that's I think that's a great question to bring up. Thank you. Let's look at another sheet we pulled in. Actually, sorry, let's go back to this one and let's go over a few things in it. One thing that this person decided to do, which I think is a good idea, is to take what some people might consider to be one piece of information, someone's full name and split it into two parts: first name, last name. There are some cases where that might actually be inconvenient to you. And again, no right answer, no wrong answer, but splitting out the names could be helpful in the future. Let's say you were gathering more information on guests and you wanted to be able to group them easily by their last name. It's going to be much easier if that's a separate field. Let's go, before we go to the dates, let's go to can read and invisible friends. Let's do invisible friends first, because that, in some ways, that's the simplest. It's a yes/no question. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as a Boolean value or a true/false value. And there's no totally authoritative way to do this in a spreadsheet. I think 1 and 0 is a great way to deal with it. Y and N for yes and no, true and false. They're all legitimate as long as you have sort of a consistent way of addressing that or of entering that information. Let's go to can read. I made it kind of intentionally trickier because in my mind, it's not really a true/false question. It's more of what you call a categorical value. That there are categories of reading ability, and those categories are more than one, right? Maybe there are 3 or 4, maybe it's even a scale. Like this wasn't in the prompts, but maybe you could say on a scale from 1 to 10, Jack and Wendy read this well, and Danny reads this other level of well. I will show you what I did for that. Is I had reading level, proficient, beginner. Maybe there's some other value you'd want to add down the road. Not to say can read is wrong. Again, there may be, or sorry, yes and no for can read may be wrong. There may be instances where you really just do want to know, are they good at reading? Are they not good at reading for your own purposes? And that simplification could be valuable and helpful. Age, other than the fact there's some questionable values for Danny and the age and birthday, age was a pretty straightforward one. I think looking at the ones I've opened so far, everyone did it pretty much the same. Numbers are in some ways the easiest thing to deal with in a spreadsheet. And age is something we have a pretty standard way of representing. Nobody here, including myself, put years as the unit for age. I think because it's so clearly obvious that these people, their age would be quantified in years. You could imagine if you were doing something about like, members of or some people checked into a hospital where you may have some infants, then you might start wanting to represent age in a different way. But for this worked great. So dates. Dates are something that, in my mind, represent kind of a fundamental thing to be thinking about when structuring data. Dates can be interpreted differently depending on where you live. Oh, I see a hand up. Paul.
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, and not to split hairs, but I actually thought this might be part of the exercise on reading. I mean, it's conceivable that Danny can read Spanish fluently, and just seems like we should be saying reads English or proficiency.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Right, there's a lot of information left out of this prompt, a lot of information about these people that we don't know. And we probably shouldn't assume that when we talk about language, the only language we can be talking about is English. I think that's a great point. I think, probably the easiest way to handle it, right, would be to rename the column can read English. Another possibility would be to add documentation, and we'll get to doing documentation in a little bit, but to add documentation that would make that clearer. So basically say this column can read specifically relates to English, and that we don't know their reading level in other languages. But a great point. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so dates. Dates are tricky because they are at times ambiguous. And in fact, I intentionally use dates here that could be read ambiguously. Depending on what country you live in, the date here may be interpreted as August 3rd, 1946, or March 8th, 1946. Because when written in this order, there are basically two opposing standards for interpreting that. Well, a project I worked on a couple years ago was a collaboration with another reporter, and I was trying to convince them to avoid this problem, that we were working with source data that represented dates in some ways ambiguously, that the source data had dates that looked like this. And I was saying we should do some work up front to make them less ambiguous. And this other reporter was saying, well, we can deal with that later. We ended up getting in a bit of some quicksand, because at a certain point we had these were police agencies, we had two different police agencies using different representations of the date, and it ended up being a huge headache to go back and revise them. So I would suggest, when at all possible, using the YYYY MMDD format for dates. It removes all possible ambiguity from dates. No matter what part of the world you live in, you will read these the exact same way. You don't have to necessarily use dashes in between the sections, but in this case, it's really the order, year, month, date that matters. And not to say that dates are the most important thing we should be focusing on here, but they're sort of representative of this idea that when at all possible, remove as much ambiguity as you can as early on in the data structuring process as you can. It also ends up being, if you're going to work with this data in a programming language or even in Excel, you're going to have a much easier time confidently and correctly converting this kind of character representation of the date into the sort of more fundamental date representation. It'll make it easier to do things like adding and subtracting dates to figure out how many days are in between, assigning dates to their correct month, and so on. I'm going to go to another sheet that I received. Let's see. I believe, where is it? Here. It deals with this in a different way. Entirely valid. Entirely valid. A little bit less compact, but potentially useful in other ways. So this person did birth, month, day, and year separately. They did basically what other people had done with the person's name, right? Separating the full name into its constituent parts. They did this with the birth date. And this works. And sometimes this can actually be what you want. It would make it much easier to say, let's figure out everyone who has a birthday in August. In a spreadsheet, it's actually going to be a lot easier to do it this way. It's going to be harder for some other things, but that's fine. You see, this person, to Paul's point, had a different way of dealing with languages. They said English fluent, English fluent, English partial, which makes sense. This handles Paul's concern. It also handles the issue of it being a sort of categorical value versus a true false or yes no value. It does raise the question, which we didn't address in the prompt, what happens if someone knows more than one language? How would you represent that? That's probably something for another day, but if we have time, we can talk about that a little bit later. I haven't looked at all the sheets that people sent in, but one thing I didn't see in the initial sheets was the room that people are staying in. That's fine. Maybe it's because everyone was staying in the same room. Maybe other people didn't, I just didn't see it. But let's get to the next part of the exercise, which is fairly simple. It's what we already have with the addition of one little extra bit of information, which I will add in right now. Oops. Okay, hopefully you can all see it on the screen and in the document you have open. When you take just another couple minutes, it's not a very complex addition, to reflect that in your sheet.
Jeremy, we're not sending that to you again, right?
No, if you've already shared it with me, I'm going to go through some of the ones we haven't looked at yet. But if you've already shared it to me, that you only have to do it once.
Great.
Jeremy, on the date thing, if I wanted to reformat mine from the way it was in the example into the year, month, day, is there a way to do that, or I would just have to manually?
So this is actually there is and there isn't. So both Excel and Google do something that can be kind of annoying, which is they take dates, they sort of convert them into their internal representation, and then you can reformat them however you want. They're little, each tool has its own kind of format option for that. And because your computer is, registered as sort of a US computer, like the locality settings are US related, it will know that if you entered it month, day, year, that's really what you meant. However, I would really recommend, just sort of for safety's sake, rewriting them from scratch. If you can. If it ends up being a huge headache because you have a ton of entries, I would, it's not necessarily wrong to reformat them automatically. I just pay extra attention to make sure that Excel or Google did it correctly. I'm going to start copying some of these over. And some that have really interesting new things we haven't talked about. Start with these two because they actually address the issue very well. And we're actually going to go back to discuss one more thing. So this sheet did something interesting before we even get to the Mrs. Massey question. Whoever made this added a column for gender. There's nothing about gender mentioned in the spreadsheet or in the prompt, which is fine. But it kind of raised the point that there may be information beyond what is explicitly noted that you add because of other knowledge you have outside of the document at hand or the explicit information at hand. It may be helpful, it may be essential even to the project you're working on. But as you're thinking about documenting it, and I would argue it's sort of essential as much as you can to document your process, to keep notes about how you built a spreadsheet or the methodology you used. It's good to distinguish between things that were listed literally and things that have been implied or are based on your own external knowledge. The other interesting thing about this sheet is how it dealt with the information we don't know, right? I intentionally had the first exercise have complete information on every question, essentially, for every person. That is the dream, right? That you get a data set that is comprehensive and complete. It almost never is reality. You're almost always dealing with some unknowns or ambiguities, which we did touch on, or errors. But probably the most common thing, especially when dealing with other people's data, is incompleteness. And this person took what I think is a very straightforward approach. It is a commonly understood standard and abbreviation to list N/A for not applicable or not available, missing, something like that. I think anyone else using this spreadsheet would get a very clear understanding that this is information that is missing. There are some situations in which it might not be the right choice because, for example, let's say you were using this to send out party invitations. You probably don't want to call this person N.A. Massey. Maybe you could handle it in a different way when you were processing the data, but using NA or another very unambiguous identifier, I think, is a great approach. Now let's look at another approach that is interesting because it's a very common way of doing things. Let's actually take a note of some other information in here that I think was a useful and interesting way of approaching things. We talked about how there was some ambiguity in dates. This person decided to make that ambiguity less ambiguous, right? They said in their column header, this is month date. No matter who's going to read this, hopefully, they're going to understand that even if it's not their local standard for reading dates, it's been documented in a way that makes the issue less of a concern. The other thing they did, it appears, I'm just guessing here, is that they use the color yellow to indicate that there's something questionable about these values. As we discussed, right, it doesn't, here what they did actually is looks like they said, here's what I think their age should be based on their birth date, and colored them both yellow because there's some ambiguity there or some question of data quality. They added other interesting information too, right? That sort of what I would say are kind of computed values. They said, well, how long have they stayed there, given that we know what today is and what their check-in date was? Are they still there? This is implied by the fact that we're saying they're currently tenants or currently staying there. That can be useful. That can be something that you either do in the raw data here or you compute some other way. One thing that I haven't seen and that's worth touching on, this is something you could do in your documentation, or what I did in my spreadsheet is used it in the, I don't know if you can see this at the bottom of the screen, but named the sheet. I said occupants as of November 3rd, 1975. Some indication of at what point this data was correct or up to date. So let's talk about the other thing here. Instead of just leaving the cells with unknown information entirely blank, they've added a yellow highlighting to what is blank. There are, I would say, no strict rules about how to represent missing data. Blanks are definitely a valid option. What the ambiguity they create is a question of whether, is this information unknown, or did I just not get to it? Did I not have the time to finish filling this spreadsheet out? Maybe it's something like, oh, I'm going to look into it later. This is a problem I've come across in my own work. Like, I've made this complication for myself unintentionally before, where it's not clear whether something is really missing or just not completed yet. The way this person dealt with it was to add yellow highlighting, a sort of visual reminder that there is, that they addressed these columns or these cells, but there was nothing to put in there. There is a downside to using color, and I'm going to share with you at the end of this session what I think is a pretty nice overview of some data structuring guidelines. And those guidelines say very affirmatively, do not use color to encode information. The reason is that most tools, including Excel and Google Sheets themselves, have no way of processing color as a piece of data. if you wanted to know the difference between which cells were empty and which cells were empty in yellow, there's no way really to do that. So you're sort of, it can be useful for your own eye in sort of keeping track of your progress, but it will be very hard, virtually impossible to take that information into account if you're using it, if you're processing it with, in one of these tools or in Tableau or in, a programming language. So it's something to keep in mind. Let me add that last bit of information. This is a much more fictional scenario. I'm gonna delete what we have here just to make it easier. This is additional information that I don't want to tip the scales too much, but let's say it's up to you how you want to represent it. There are no rules. And we'll take another 5 minutes for this one.
Quick question, Jeremy. Is
Sure,
that
yeah.
for like Jack, for example, is that 9 books total, or is that 7 books, 7 novels, and then the 2 books about the hotels are a part of that?
So for all of these, they are separate. So 9
Okay.
books in total, 7 novels, 2 history books. Right, okay. So let's go back to the view. Here we go. So here are a few examples. Let me make this a little easier to see. Move this one. So the point of this exercise was to sort of challenge you and to put you in a situation where you have to figure out, sort of like in what we were talking about with the languages someone might know. You might have heard this phrase, one-to-many relationships, where you have a lot of things associated with, say, one individual or one sort of entry. In this case, we have in our original spreadsheet, 1 row per person, but each person has multiple types of books checked out, and we want to know how to deal with it. One approach would be to do what this person did, which is to say, we're going to aggregate for every person the calculations we feel are important, right? We might want to know how many books do they borrow. So this person added up the number of books, and then you have just one value per person, number of books per person. They also came up with some other sort of aggregates that we might care about. Number of novels borrowed, novel fee, history book fees, Mark and Engels books. Great. That is a valid way of representing this data. However, it can start to get, as this person might have noticed as they started to add more and more columns, slowly more and more unwieldy, or less and less wieldy, if you can say that. This person did something similar. They broke out, they tried to keep everything on 1 line per person. Same here. And same here. So I didn't see them all. It's possible other people took different approaches. And we don't have a ton of time left, but I will give you sort of a view of how I would recommend doing something like this. It's called, you might hear it called long data or tidy data, but the idea is to, for every entry or every, well, here's another way to think about it. Try to keep your columns as narrow as possible. If you find yourself repeating information or categorical information across many columns, think about instead, how could I enter that information in a long way, going down the spreadsheet? The approach I took here was to say, okay, everyone has a first name and a last name. That's enough to identify them. We don't need all of the information about what room they're in, and so on. We could combine that later and say, what's a category of book we're talking about? What's the broad genre? How many books fit that category for that person? How many late fees did they have? In addition to, in my mind, just being a little easier to keep track of, it also makes things, I believe you all worked on pivot tables. It makes pivot tables work a lot more smoothly. Now you can create a pivot table for that information you wanted to select in any sort of combination, or in many more granular combinations than you could by putting everything on one line for each person. So now, we could say right now it's grouped by first name, like how many fees per person and how many books per person. But we could change that very easily in a pivot table to by genre. So now we know the breakdown of fiction to nonfiction, how many fees for each. You can go on, but the idea, when you're thinking about structuring data and things start to get what we call nested data or one-to-many data, to have a sort of reflex to say, maybe this could take a different shape. Maybe this could be long, we could do this in a long way rather than a wide way. I realize we're coming right up to time, and I don't want to keep you any longer than you've signed up for. I will say, though, you have my contact information, and Anne can share more of it. If you have any questions about this, if you want me to review specifically what you had entered and give feedback, I'm more than welcome to do that. And I am going to share the guidelines I was talking about before. This is a free and open academic paper that touches on a lot of what we discussed, a little bit more specific to the sciences. In some cases, strong opinions where you don't necessarily need to follow them, but I think actually pretty solid advice. If you have any questions not related to the data, my inbox is also open. For the exercise, I'd be happy to stay in touch.
I don't know if you have time for any questions right now, but there is one from Allie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have as much time as you would all like. I just, I know you guys have a lot of screen time today. Didn't want to keep you over.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Allie says, you mentioned not using a color to flag certain data. What is a better way to do that? Generally speaking, I would suggest making a new column that reflects what it is you meant to say in that with that color. Missing data is a sort of special case where I think you can just come up with a value you use, like NA or all caps blank or all caps unknown, that can do a pretty good job of representing it without having to create a new column. But I would suggest, for example, if you had questions about the birth date, instead of coloring it yellow, having a new column that said birth date questionable and was just a yes, no, something like that, or reflecting it in the notes. I will also share, while we're at that, something we didn't get to, which is the idea of creating a data dictionary. It's a useful exercise for yourself. It'll also make it much easier for your coworkers to understand what's going on. I, for example, decided when I made my spreadsheet that I was going to use a question mark as the value of unknown, and I reflected that in my data dictionary, which just says, okay, here's the table name, here's the column name, here's a description, including that's where you would say, for example, here, and I said occupant's ability to read in English, choices proficient, intermediate, beginner. Okay. David asks, what's a way you use spreadsheets in your life that has been the most helpful? Oh, that's fun. I'll never get to it, but I had this idea. It'd be fun to do a podcast asking people the same question, like how do you organize your life with spreadsheets? I have a bunch of spreadsheets. The one that's probably most useful right now is I kind of log the time I'm spending writing Data Is Plural, both as a sort of a check to make sure that I'm not spending longer and longer times every week until it takes up my whole life, but also just to get a sense of a better sort of self-quantification of the breakdown. That's one way. I used to do it when I lived with roommates. We used it for sharing expenses, kind of obvious stuff like that. MLI says, can you please share with us these example spreadsheets? Are you referring to the one I made or the ones that everyone else made?
The one you made.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can share that with you. I will create a link and I'll send it to Anne, which I think she can, actually, I can probably just do it now.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We really appreciated you taking us through this exercise. I think it's something that everyone is going to remember. So everyone, let's give Jeremy a round of applause.
Thank you. And
Thank you
thanks for participating so fully. I got a ton of sheets. I'm sorry if I didn't get to every single one of yours, but the examples you provided were like a really fantastic diversity of different ways of approaching this. You made my life easy.